The reading for Sumer does a pretty good job of describing the military and political actions of the Sumerian city-states. But the first rulers of those city-states weren't kings. They were high priests. These priests ran temples that became the center of urban civilization. These temples were considered to be the homes of gods here on earth. Each god had his own house or his own temple. These temples functioned as warehouses, as storehouses for grain and for other goods the villagers in the surrounding countryside would bring in as some type of sacrifice to the god. But that sacrifice came with some payback. During the famine months, there would be a redistribution of food. And of course, the priests got to take a cut off of the top. What that meant was that the priests got to increase their wealth, while the surrounding villages and other people that were starting to move and live close to the city got an increased sense of stability. There would always be food. As long as you provided for the god would provide for you. There was a catch to this, however. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were very unpredictable in their seasons. Sometimes they would flood, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they would change course entirely. And so the Sumerian and later on Mesopotamian mythology reflected this characteristic of nature. The gods are capricious in their personalities. They have a tendency to mess with humans simply because they're bored or they're having a bad day. Case in point, we have the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story that was told first in Sumer, later on in Mesopotamia. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, we have a story of the gods becoming so annoyed with humans just for being too noisy. They send a flood either to wipe out the city that's annoying them or the entirety of humanity, depending on which version of the story we're reading. These gods killed humans not because humans did something wrong, but because they were just having a bad day. That being said, even though gods sometimes would be cruel just because they felt like being cruel, it still behooved humans to stay on their good side. So humans continued to give of the things they grew and made to the god, and the gods usually continued to provide back. What that also meant was that the priests were able to build larger and larger temples. And by the time we get to the Bronze Age, we have the creation of ziggurats. This is ruins of a ziggurat in the city of Ur and a reconstruction of what we think that ziggurat might have looked like. Now, these were not churches. These were not areas where everybody got to go in and actually worship the god directly. The god would be kept as an idol, as a statue in the center of the ziggurat, and only be brought out every now and then to remind the peasants who they were actually worshiping. But it was up to the priests to actually perform the ceremonies of worship for that god. Now, throughout the Neolithic, Sumer, which you can see down here in the southeast portion of Mesopotamia, Mesopotamia being this entire land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Throughout the Neolithic, there was plenty of land for the Sumerian cities-states to continue to expand without having to fight for anything. However, by the time we get to around the year 2800, about 400 years into the Bronze Age, land was starting to run out, and competition was starting to increase. Now, those high priests didn't have total control over the populace. Throughout the villages and the countryside, clan heads were still in charge of their families. They were still making most of the calls, and it was the clan heads in the villages and the countryside who were dealing with the competition as the different city-states were spreading into each other's territories. And so it was the clan heads that were in charge of a new part of human history, warfare. And by the year 2800 BCE, when the competition between the city-states was heavily underway, a new tool was invented, the bronze sword. This was an extension of the old stone daggers of the Neolithic. And bronze swords weren't that cheap to make. The advent of the bronze sword changed the game. Warfare became the domain of a professional warrior class, which was able to afford the bronze weaponry. That warrior class was able to set themselves up and take power from the high priests who could speak for the god, but couldn't necessarily fight for them. What we get with the emergence of the bronze sword is also the emergence of kings of the city-states. Now, these kings couldn't just pretend like the old gods no longer existed. They needed to be legitimized by these gods, and what ended up taking place after the year 2800 was that high priests were appointed by kings. They became the tools of kings. This is just a few of the different Mesopotamian gods out of the dozens, out of the scores, really. Nana, a goddess of fertility, sometimes on the Arabian Peninsula referred to as Sin. Keep that in the back of your mind as we move forward into the Iron Age later on. Enki, a god who was kind of the trickster amongst the gods. He causes a lot of problems for humans. Marduk, you can see seated on the right here, giving his law to the king Hammurabi, who you'll be reading about later. Marduk was the god of Babylon, and originally not a very important god, but as we'll see, throughout the centuries, he becomes increasingly important, particularly throughout Mesopotamia. This relationship between gods and kings will become the foundation for all future kings throughout Mesopotamia and the Levant, all the way up until we get to the Classical Age. Egypt is going to be a different story.